Welcome back to our afternoon session. So again, for those who are new, I won't read any bios, they are printed in the program. And for our viewers online, you can find the program at the AMS website, AMS-SW.org. So this is the last paper session. We have 3 papers, and our first presenter is Yu Ye from the University of Texas at Austin. Please welcome.
Today my topic is music identity between cosmopolitanism and nationalism. It's a discussion on making tango music in contemporary music, in contemporary China. So on the night of January 20th, 2019, the atmosphere became heated in the Rosa Tango Club, the most famous tango venue in Chengdu city. Nearly 100 people gathered at the dance floor, enchanted by the live performance of Chinese tango musicians. It is the closing concert for the second bandoneon workshop of Chengdu, led by the most influential Chinese bandoneonist, Liu Shanshan. So I put the last name at the front in the Chinese tradition. So this the female musician playing the bandoneon is currently the leading bandoneonist, one of the leading bandoneonists in China, who is also the young accordion professor in Sichuan Conservatory of Music. In this concert, Liu and her professional tango orchestra performed together with the workshop students. Some of the students are teacher and students from the music school and the conservatory, and the others are just the music lovers or the amateurs. Half a year ago, on October 6, 2018, another sold-out tango concert took place in La Plantation Theater, one of the best acoustic venues for chamber music performance in Beijing. As the closing concert for the 5th bandoneon master class and the training camp, it was led by another Chinese bandoneonist, Wang Dan, a former accordion student of the Central Conservatory of Music in Beijing, also and her teacher, one of the greatest Argentinian bandoneonists, Pablo Valera. The concert was performed again by Wang's tango orchestra, which is named Fire and Ice Tango Orchestra. The above 2 concerts are just some of the recent examples to show China's keen interest in tango culture in the last decade. During the last 10 years, we have witnessed the uprising of tango dance clubs in over 30 major cities in China, besides the tango dance. People also show great passion for tango music, especially its iconic instrument bandoneon, and also the tango history. There are growing master classes, concerts, festivals, lectures, and publications on various topics of tango. Along with these activities, we also see the formation of a new generation of Chinese tango musicians. So this paper will mainly focus on the scene of making tango music in contemporary China, and we'll discuss how the group of young Chinese tango musicians emerge and construct tango as a cultural genres, and how they negotiate the music identities in the performance. The history of tango music in China could be traced back to the early 20th century. So since its birth in River Plate region and outskirts of Buenos Aires city in the late 19th century, tango soon gained its popularity in Europe and America in the 1910s and 1920s. This wave of tango craze also spread to China, first at Shanghai and then to the other cities at the same time. Shanghai, hailed as Paris of the Orient then, was one of the most important cultural centers in East Asia in the early 20th centuries. Between the 1920s and 2040s, Shanghai had a flourishing cabaret culture in its urban space, and dance music was an essential part of it. So here are some photos of the Shanghai Paramount. So it's one of the most popular nightclub and dance hall in Shanghai at the time in the 1930s and 40s. And regarding the tango, the author Andrew Field, actually in his book Shanghai's Dancing World, once wrote, quote, "The Argentinian tango first appeared in Shanghai in 1913, when a pair of dancers performed at a restaurant known for introducing new dance steps there. Its popularity soon gave rise to tango teas, held in the western district of the international settlement." End quote. So you can see that tango, as one of the many new dances at that time, began to replace the older styles in the ballroom around the globe. And here I could show you it's. Let's see. Kind of a remastered CD. Kind of remnants of some of the dancing world and dancing culture, including the tango culture at the time in Shanghai. After the 1949, the establishment of the People's Republic of China, tango, along with many other Western social dance, such as foxtrot, one-step, two-step, to a great extent disappeared from the entertainment of everyday life in China, often criticized as the product and the pollution of the bourgeois class. These dances were replaced by the official nationalist and communist propaganda art during the various political movement, and were no longer acceptable due to the ideological factors. It was until the 1980s when China reopened her window to the world. The Western world acquired its influence again in mainland China. However, as entertainment culture genres, tango music never regained the same popularity as it was in the 1920s and 1930s in China. So the year 2000 marked the new era of tango music in China. In this year, Polo Art, which is a very influential publisher company in Beijing, imported 2 CDs of Astor Piazzolla's music to mainland China. Both CDs were the reinterpretation of Piazzolla's works by the classical trained musicians. And this is the first time that Chinese audience in mainland heard Piazzolla's Tango Nueva style, which is a fusion of traditional tango, contemporary classical music, and jazz. Piazzolla's music soon aroused a wave of tango fever in Chinese audience, especially among the students in music school and conservatories. While in most music schools of China, the canons of Western classical music and Chinese national music still occupy the central stage, Piazzolla's exploration seems to point out an innovative cross-boundary path for many performance and composition students, which was both national and transnational, as the bandoneonist Liu Sansan pointed out, quote, "It is tango, yet not the tango at the same time," end quote. Piazzolla's impact was so powerful that even today, if you go to any tango music concert in China, a large portion of the repertoire are all his Tango Nueva works. Moreover, the Chinese media still purposefully advertise him as the father of the tango, though it is far from the historical fact. after 2000, the publisher companies saw the opportunity and successively imported some other tango CDs. And some of them were Piazzolla's music performed by his own tango ensemble, and some were the other more traditional tango music. So all these resources built a solid foundation for the later dramatic boom of tango music in recent years, in recent 10 years in China. Since 2009, tango lovers began to establish tango dance milongas and clubs in major cities of China, and around the tango festivals in metropolitan centers. The number of the academic publications, so here are some list of the recent tango clubs and tango milongas, just in recent 10 years. And the number of the academic publications and translated books on the topics of tango is steadily increasing. The university and the conservatories begin to invite the tango dance experts and the bandoneon masters directly from Argentina to give master classes and performances. All these activities endeavors to build the tango cultural network once again after the decades of the 1920s and 1930s. This network also provides the soil for the emergence of a new generation of Chinese tango musicians, mostly conservatory students born in the 1970s or 1980s. So after several years absorption and digestion, Chinese musicians began to form their tango band. So actually at present in China, there are already 5 different music ensembles or tango orchestras, and they all regularly play tango music. And usually in every band, the bandoneonist acts as the band leader or the ensemble leader. So here I will just point out the first 2 orchestra, the tango orchestra and the leader. Interestingly, there are both 2 female bandoneonists, and they are the only 2. They are the only 2 bandoneon players so far have the experience studying abroad. So like Liu Sansan, who is the band leader of the Liu Sansan Tango Orchestra Típica. She spent 4 and 5 years in Europe and studied with the French, the Argentina tango maestro Juan Mosalil, lived in Paris. And the other one, Wang Dan, several years ago went to Argentina to study with the Argentinian bandoneonist Pablo Huayla in Buenos Aires. So far I've introduced some information about the new generation of the Chinese tango musicians and their emergence. So how do they negotiate the music identities through the performance? Let's go back to the 2 concerts I mentioned at the very beginning. So for the first concert, actually for these 2 concerts, their repertoires are very different. Like for the first one, which is happening in the tango club, most of the repertoire they are all from the Astor Piazzolla's Tango Nuevo works. And for the second one, it's more like a balance of the Piazzolla, and also we have there's 7 and 8 pieces from the more traditional style, like some works from Juan D'Arienzo and Troilo, and somehow. But interestingly, even if these 2 concepts have totally different idea of how to present the tango music, both of them share the similarity, leaving a unique section at the end, which is called Chinese tango. I think this is not a coincidence. Actually, the idea of Chinese tango is so important at the time. So that every tango orchestra at that time, in China, one of the central tasks is to construct the meaning of the Chinese tango. So here I quote an interview from the Chinese bandoneonist Wang Dan. So once she said, "It is Chinese tango that defines who you are." However, when expressing the idea of Chinese tango, the musicians constantly negotiate the musical identities between the nationalism and the cosmopolitanism, according to their respective aesthetic taste. So, for example, so these are one clips of the concert performance happening in the Beijing. So when the concert actually goes to the section of so-called Chinese tango, we have three. It's a kind of tango style arrangement of very popular Chinese folk tunes or the popular tunes. And this is one of them. Melody is actually from the very popular Chinese folk tune. It's called see that it's a very clear nationalist attempt by the violinist Wang Dan and her tango orchestra. But some other musicians might have some different ideas. For example, the first concert I mentioned, putting performance in Chengdu in the tango club. So this is a commission work. Another attempt I would call more cosmopolitan, written by the very young Chinese composer, Boris He, who's a graduate from the composition department of the University of North Carolina. That's why I give the title as the musical identities negotiating between the cosmopolitanism and the nationalism. In sum, tango music and culture has gained a rapid flourish in China in the last 10 years. But if you put it in a bigger picture, actually, the development of tango in China is a part of the global tango revival happening since the 1980s, which is a product of the international governmental support plan and the musicians' active idea exchange. Also, I will conclude that. Also, I would say that all these phenomena happening in China right now, regarding tango, is also a good example. It's also a good example of a musical appropriation and musical interculturalism and transnationalism, which I will explore further in my dissertation to this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions, open for questions. Anybody has any? Yes.
This is probably a bit of an impossible question because I know that Wong Kar-wai, the filmmaker, is maybe not as often seen in Shanghai as he's seen in other places in the world. But I wonder if you could speak at all about the influence of film, particularly forward-thinking 90s film like Wong Kar-wai's cinema. Do you think that that has a role in this?
You mean Tango, yes?
Yeah, I think specifically.
I think one of the Wong Kar-wai's movie, I think Happy Together, yes? I forget the name. I think that one is basically the whole story and the location. They are all located in the Buenos Aires, and there's also the film music. I think most of them are using the music of Astor Piazzolla. Yes, so I would say it's a kind of you could say it's a kind of resemblance, the similar phenomenon happening in the film. I would say the music actually, especially the tango music, especially the direct communication between China and Argentina regarding the tango actually only happens only recently. So it's a kind of behind what's happening in Japan and also in Taiwan.
It's really great. Thanks for pulling this together. Do you see the same kind of interest in tango as a dance form? Does the dance itself accompany the performances?
Actually, it's a very tricky question. And because when studying UT, I also joined the tango clubs, and sometimes dance every week. I think one of the problem is tango. At least when I talk about dance music, tango is very different from, like, if you're talking about some other Latin music dance, like salsa, like salsa or the other. So I would say the path of the tango music actually has a very strange divergence, especially after Astor Piazzolla. Because last summer I went to another, it's like a tango workshop in Portland. So when I interview all the musicians there, they say, no, why should I have to dance? Yeah, so they say, I hate music. Why tango music has to be conform to the needs of the dancers. And also vice versa, because also I talk to many tango dancers. So sometimes if they see some live band doing the performance, they will go, because they say we would prefer dance to those very classic tango CDs or recordings. I would say maybe fundamentally they have different maybe aesthetic opinions about the tango per se. But I would say it's a kind of I don't like it. I don't like it. But I would say the real charm of the tango is not tango as music or not tango just as dance, but it's a kind of mixture and a fusion. Always combining music, dance, and also the poetry. Yeah, the words together. Yeah. Anyway, there's something happening at the moment.
Other questions? Let online. There's no online questions, so let us thank our speaker one more time. Next, we will take 1 minute to set up the computer. So this second presentation in this session is delivered by Alfredo Coleman from Baylor University, and he's talking about Florentin Jimenez Symphony No. 9, The Resurgence of a Paraguayan Musical Nationalism. Please welcome him.
Thank you. I've been working on this topic for a while now, for a few years, and this is still an ongoing project, and attempting to uncover information in a new territory. That's the works of this composer. All right, so a strong advocate for the defense of cultural identity, Florentin Jimenez is one of the most prolific Paraguayan composers within the context of a Paraguayan music nationalism. His Sinfonia No. 9, Heroic Deeds of Our History, integrates Paraguayan folk music idioms with the approach of late 19th century European composers and early to mid 20th century Latin American musical nationalism. The focus of this presentation is to discuss the context to Jimenez's particular application of musical nationalism in his Symphony No. 9 by theorizing on a series of cultural themes associated with the work. By evaluating specific passages in the symphony, we will observe that this work reveals the composer's desire to be memorialized as the promoter of a reimagined Paraguayan cultural and musical identity. An intriguing and quasi-solitary figure embracing a Latin American musical nationalism in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Florentin Jimenez has become a unique individual whose career and compositions illustrate aspects of a Paraguayan culture developed and established as a model of social and cultural identity. Who is Florentin Jimenez? He was born in 1925 in Uruguay, Paraguay, and at 15, he moved to Asunción, the capital, where he studied clarinet and percussion at the Asunción Police Academy Music School. An already accomplished pianist by the late 1940s, Jimenez organized his own ensemble, the Orquesta Ritmos de América. He's there seated at the piano. In 1950, he organized his own Orquesta Típica, which followed the model of Argentine tango ensembles. Performing the popular music of the times, the orchestra became a favorite at local social and dance events. They also toured portions of Argentina during that time. In 1956, he moved to Buenos Aires, where he studied music theory and harmony at the Carlos López Buchardo Conservatory, and composition with the Italian pianist and violinist Cayetano Marcoli. In 1969, he returned to Paraguay, and in 1973, he became assistant conductor of the Asunción Symphony. After serving as the orchestra's main conductor for about 14 years, he was appointed by the Paraguayan Senate composer in residence of the city of Asunción. In 1997, he became founder and director of the National Conservatory of Music. And in 2004, he organized and founded the National Symphony Orchestra, which he conducted until 2008, when he retired. He still composes. He just turned 94 a month ago or so. His musical output includes more than 850 canciones populares, I would say folkloric music in the shape and form of art songs, works for piano, a folk mass and opera, 13 zarzuelas, 2 instrumental suites, 3 concertos for violin, viola, and 2 guitars, 2 symphonic poems, and 9 symphonies. A prolific writer, Mr. Jimenez has also published books discussing Paraguayan music and folklore, as well as novels. Since his retirement in 2008, he has been revising and transcribing his concert works, as well as composing and releasing recordings of his canciones populares. And I said about 850. To this date, he is almost reaching 900. Sometimes I feel I cannot keep up with the research and what he's doing. Okay, let's talk about the Symphony Number 9. Premiere on November 29th, 2017, the Symphony Number 9 functions as a musical account celebrating Paraguayan culture and identity, a concept synonymous with the term Paraguayidad, or Paraguayanness, or the way of being Paraguayan. Jimenez's celebration of his Paraguayidad is achieved through the various cultural themes presented in the 4 movements of the work, highlighting topics such as the historical memory, program music, Guarani culture, mestizaje, folk music idioms, and cultural identity. By the way, Guarani is also the native group that was present in the region at the time of the arrival of the Iberians in the 16th century. Though by the nature of the symphony, both the historical memory and program music inform each one of the movements, other sections include specific themes. For instance, in the first movement, the conquest and the cry of the comuneros, the composer employs the themes of Guarani culture and mestizaje. Represented by an imagined Guarani soundscape, Jimenez includes an introductory section with voices in unison, accompanied by wind and percussion instruments playing repetitive motives. By the way, Mr. Jimenez admires the works of both Villalobos and Chavez from Mexico, and he attempts to, at times, model his work after those techniques. So let's hear a few seconds of the introduction to the first movement. Later, through the inclusion of a quasi-Iberian melody, the composer intends to describe the arrival of the Spaniards, and by the addition of the habanera rhythm, even at a later point, he emphasizes the encounter between Guarani and Iberian, as well a subsequent biological and cultural mestizaje, what he refers to in his own words as, quote, an anthropological existential syncretism, end quote. So let me get to the point where we hear this quasi-Iberian melody. Heard some percussion as well in the background. This is where the habanera rhythmic section begins. course, he's using the habanera rhythm, even though this time that he's attempting to retell in history is around the late 16th century, early 17th century. Predating the French Revolution and representing a social uprising by settlers in 18th century Paraguay, Jimenez's section, The Cry of the Comuneros, paints with melodic motifs extracted from La Marseillaise, a soundscape that intends to combine both the themes of hope and defeat. Nevertheless, his intention is to announce the beginnings of the patriotic sentiment that will be key in the formation of a cultural identity. By the way, the Cry of the Comuneros, or the Grito Comunero, was a social revolution that actually took place twice, in the 1730s and then 1760s. And that, of course, predates the French Revolution, but also Paraguayan independence in 1811. So let's go next to En la Independencia, or At Independence. This section introduces a modified version of the Himno Nacional Primitivo, or the primitive national anthem, clearly pointing out to the theme of nationhood and patriotism. In the same movement, represented by a group of rhythmically modified folk dance melodies, a series of folk music idioms are introduced announcing musical forms that later will be presented in compound duple meter with hemiola effect, a typical feature found in Paraguayan folkloric music. So what we'll hear next is a few seconds of folk music in triple meter that later will be introduced again in compound duple meter. The third movement, At the Great War, at the Guerra Grande, intends to memorialize the later 19th century war against the Triple Alliance, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. Through the retelling of a series of battles, the loss of war, and the aftermath, singing in Guarani, the choir laments by repeating the phrase, Tejendu Tetagua, or listen, Paraguayan people, while a few female voices, Las Residentas, or female survivors, wail in desolation. In a compelling way, the intensity of the text communicates ideas informed by Guarani culture in a narrative advocating for the defense of Paraguayan sovereignty in both national and cultural identity. Finally, the fourth movement, At the Chaco War, in My Time, moves the narrative to another major armed conflict, the Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay, which took place between 1932 and 1935. Quoting portions of folkloric music, such as the epic march, Chaco Boreal, and the Paraguayan polka, Che la Reina, or My Beloved, Jimenez intermingles a patriotic sentiment, along with the longing and nostalgia experienced by the Paraguayan soldier away from home. And as it may be expected, the composer places a heavy concentration of folk music idioms throughout the movement. So here's a brief section of Chaco Boreal, the epic march. Portion of the folk song, or the folkloric song, Che la Reina, next. then clearly he uses the hemiola technique and the folk song in compound duple meter. In the last portion, My Times, Jimenez synthesizes previous motivic and melodic ideas by employing two distinctive musical forms, the lively curtain, which is what we heard, and the melancholic guarania, which for him constitute the true and authentic representations of the spirit of our country. By the way, the guarania is slow, relaxed tempo composition in compound duple meter as well. Replete with sentiments of nationalism and pride, the text sung by the choir makes numerous references to Paraguay as a heroic country which has received the anointing of freedom for a new day, thus clearly promoting a patriotic spirit within the framework of a Paraguayan cultural identity. Now, how could we explain or understand the context for these cultural themes or the reasons why Mr. Jimenez is writing this symphony? Let's take a look at the historical memory. Since his early years as a composer, the Paraguayan historical memory has been a major source of inspiration for Jimenez. Not only he believes that one aspect of his Paraguayanidad is rooted in an appreciation and admiration of the rich and complex history of Paraguay, but also that the practical application of that appreciation has become a strong signifier of his own cultural identity. A particular publication by historian and politician Justo Pastor Benitez seems to have informed, or at least run in parallel, with some of Jimenez's choices of significant historical events depicted in his Symphony No. 9. In La Ruta, 1939, a nationalist booklet developed for primary schools, and this was to defend the country from communism at that time. Benitez divides Paraguayan history in 4 sections. Thus, among figures and events, the writer includes explorer Domingo de Irala and the Comuneros revolt, the May Revolution or independence, and José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia works, first dictator of Paraguay, the war against the Triple Alliance, and the Residentas, the defense of the Chaco, and the soldier of the Chaco, as well as a brief section entitled Guarani Folklore. Though the potential connection between Benitez's publication and Jimenez's passionate zeal for the transmission of history is inconclusive at this point, a high regard for the Paraguayan historical memory and a continuous assessment of the meaning and significance of key historical events constitute a major component in most of the composer's concert works. Guarani culture in mestizaje. Throughout Jimenez's academic works, concepts and commentaries on Guarani culture in mestizaje are frequently illustrated. For him, Guarani culture is intimately associated with the historic and cultural construction of being Paraguayan. However, his reading of a Guarani culture must be understood in regard to specific cultural material connectors, among them the Guarani language as the most transcendent element, which is spoken by the majority of the population. He believes that since Guarani words possess an inherent musical quality or sound, having a specific inflection, pattern of accentuation, or cadence, the act of speaking Guarani is one of the first steps in forming the singing and playing of folkloric music in a way that portrays an aspect of Paraguayanidad. In regard to Paraguayan music and program music, the composer believes that academic, concert, or classical music inspired by folk rhythms and forms from a given country or region may cause an awareness of cultural pride, thus evoking strong nationalist or patriotic sentiments among those individuals connected to the programmatic nature of such works. In publications, interviews, and casual conversation, Jimenez has continuously emphasized the duty that composers must embrace to promote the essence of their cultural identities through the use of folk music idioms. For him, the collection of representative melodic phrases, harmonic vocabulary, and rhythmic patterns associated with their folkloric music. And speaking of folkloric music, among the folk music idioms found in Paraguayan music used by Jimenez, the rhythmic patterns of the guarania and the curain, or polka paraguaya, or galopa, both in compound duple meter, as well as melodies harmonized in parallel thirds and sixths constitute his preferred choice. For the composer, these folk music idioms are seen as the innate features that identify these genres as Paraguayan, and consequently qualifying them as signifiers of an authentic Paraguayanidad. Could we then properly place Jimenez Symphony No. 9 in the context of the resurgence of a Paraguayan musical nationalism? Not only the 2017 premiere and performance of this particular work has been of major significance for the composer, but also for city government and authorities. A few days before its premiere, and through an official proclamation signed on November 23rd, 2017, Jimenez Sinfonía No. 9 was declared of interés municipal. The document recognized Jimenez's artistry as well as the historical and musical value of the composition, indicating that the work, quote, places the country in the global stage of major symphonic works, end quote. Part of the program notes for the 2017 premiere of the work referred to the symphony as, quote, an epic creation in which the author or composer stresses the valor and heroism of the Paraguayan people, and also included a brief address from Fernando Griffith, Minister and Executive Secretary of National Culture, commenting that, I apologize, it's very tiny. The Ninth Choral Symphony by Florentin Jimenez is a sublime expression to thus remember our historic deeds, those that stimulate and encourage us to continue building the nation that we desire. End quote. Both composition and composer reflect the continuous affirmation of a socially imagined and culturally inculcated sentiment, one that has been and continues to be celebrated and regularly promoted through numerous artistic expressions. While for Jimenez, a practical display of Paraguayanidad is connected to his pride and duty as a citizen, his ideas on cultural identity run in parallel with another socially embedded concept, the teco, Guarani for the Paraguayan way of being. Since the application of the Paraguayan teco becomes a signifier of practices associated with Paraguayan folklore, tradition, and culture, Florentin Jimenez's nationalist approach in his composition exemplifies the embodiment of this complex and intrinsic aspect of the Paraguayan experience. Certainly, not only has Florentin Jimenez Symphony No. 9 positioned him as a composer and promoter of Paraguayan music nationalism, but also as a describer and prescriber of a reimagined Paraguayan cultural identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very informative presentation. Questions?
Yes, thank you very much. Do any of the songs that he writes ever sort of find their way into the orchestral literature that he composes? So does he kind of reuse and adapt and change it? So did he do that in the 9th?
Yes, that's an excellent question. One of the, I would say one of the techniques that he uses is the technique of borrowing. So he will use some of the melodies from his popular songs or canciones populares, popular music, into some of his symphonic works. And in reality, Symphony No. 9 is based on the approach and even ample material from a symphonic poem that he wrote in 1979, Ciclo, which is a tribute to the city of Asunción. And the same technique that he's using here to display this idea of the Guarani or the Iberian encounter is also present in his first symphony, Symphony No. 1, which is highly informed by this concertante for piano in D minor that he wrote in 1967. The symphony is from 2001. So he does use or makes that connection. Yes?
Is clearly there's a high level of sort of national pride, national identity in this work. Is he unusual among contemporary Paraguayan composers for being so intensely nationalistic, or is he at the spearhead of a larger movement in that direction?
I would say that he is one of the few ones writing in this manner. There are other composers that will probably use some themes or ideas from time to time, but not with this intensity and this sort of systematic way. He believes that he is one of the last carriers of this nationalistic spirit, almost receiving that from the hands of Ginastera and Villalobos and others. But he actually laments in his publications that no one else is writing in this, or with this approach.
It does seem that nationalism seems to be a growing global phenomenon.
That's right. And it's possible that other composers may pick up after him or after what's going on globally and in a way write music that's based on folk themes and sources. Yes?
I'm curious, because the composer has the experience in orchestra típica, so is the composer also using some popular music sources, not only the folk?
Yes, he's for his concert music works is using folkloric music or the traditional music of Paraguay. When he was studying and working in Buenos Aires, he also composed tangos, film music, and other folkloric music from Argentina. And he would promote, I would say, those types of songs with his own orchestra. And actually, he recorded at least 3 or 4 records with his Orquesta Típica doing only Argentine tango, exclusively. So I'll be glad to share the recording with you. And he's an admirer of D'Arienzo and Pugliese and the old school masters. He was also, I believe, a friend and studied with, along with Piazzolla, the institute where Alberto Ginastera would teach contemporary music in Buenos Aires back in the 60s. Yeah.
Other questions, please?
Yes.
Thank you for the introduction to this work. This is an easy one, I guess, but you don't see a symphony number 9 with the subtitle choral without thinking of a certain association.
That's right.
It's a 4-movement symphony and all of that, but of course, it's in the wrong key. So does the association go deeper than that surface level connection?
Yes, there's a newspaper interview where Maestro Jimenez speaks that his one of his dreams was to get to a symphony number 9, a choral symphony number 9. And in the interview, he doesn't say this, but I know for a fact that he is an admirer of both Beethoven and Mahler as the most, I would say, significant composers in the development of symphonies and 19th century orchestral music. So there is a connection there.
Are there other structural connections between the 2 works, do you think?
I would, in the previous work that I mentioned, the symphonic poem, or?
Oh, this symphony and Beethoven.
And Beethoven's, and no other than the movements in B number 9 and the use of the choir.
Thank you.
In a symphony orchestra, right? Right.
Any other question? There is none online, so let us thank our speaker. We will take just 1 minute to sit. Thank you. Okay, our last but not least, our the next paper is A Moonlight Traveler in Fancy's Land, interpreting Madison Cowain's, thank you, Ghost in Paul Sanchez's song cycle Gothic Atonement, presented by Dr. Mike Morey from the University of Texas, North Texas. Please welcome.
So you have handouts, right? You have provided a handout, and the slides here are simply just reinforcement of that material, so you're welcome to travel back and forth between the two, if you will, no pun intended. The poetry of Madison Cowain is a reflection on the tumultuous upheavals of late 19th century and early 20th centuries. Yet, until recently, his work has been long forgotten in literary circles and passed over for musical settings by composers who have preferred the free verse modernist. In addition to his many volumes of poetry, 36 volumes, about nearly 3,000 poems, featuring subjects of war, nature, nostalgia, spiritualism, and transcendentalism, several of Cowain's poems also contain mythical and Gothic elements, as can be evidenced in Wasteland, the actual progenitor of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Unlike Eliot, who sought to revolutionize poetry through more modern free verse forms, often using mythical elements to evoke the fragile psychological state of humanity, Cowain preferred more traditional poetic forms, and his poetry is full of reassuring statements outlining his actual belief in ghosts, fairies, and the supernatural. It is this side of Cowain's poetry that has attracted the attention of American composer Paul Sanchez, whose fifth large-scale song cycle, Gothic Atonement, imposes a narrative of loss, betrayal, and resignation on 5 of Cowain's unrelated points. Each text in Sanchez's cycle contains images and psychological states largely connected to discourses of late 19th century Gothic fiction, such as old houses, particularly homely Gothic, ghosts, putrefaction, and the uncanny, aspects that have been given little attention in Cowain's work. This paper that I present to you today draws upon Jacques Derrida's concept of ontology and Sigmund Freud's concept of the uncanny to interpret Sanchez's selected musical renderings of Cowain's Ghost, ultimately revealing a new strand of Gothicism and modern song composition, one of intense emotional extremes, yet full of eternal stillness. Tangentially, it also aims to intensify the scholarly discourse on Cowain and to ignite analytical perspectives in the work of one of America's new leading song composers. Known as the Keats of Kentucky, Madison Cowain was quite popular during his heyday, having attracted the attention of William Dean Howells, Harold Monroe, President Theodore Roosevelt, and several literati circles in Europe, and it has been suggested that his work revitalized the reputation of American poetry in European circles at a time when its influence had waned. However, in order for early 20th century literary critics to make their coveted chronological narratives tidier, Cowain's position in the American literary canon has now taken a back seat. He wrote in traditional verse forms during a time when more modernist approaches to writing were becoming fashionable. Since his death in 1914, several scholars and critics have put forth more categorical divisions of his poetry to reveal the nuances in his work, yet none have mentioned the Gothic tinges that are present in several of his poems. Gothicism is manifested in several of Cowain's poems through imagery, mode of discourse, and narrative patterns, provides insight into another side of Cowain's work, particularly the use of the uncanny. The uncanny elements that are characterized a large part of homely Gothic fiction and poetry in the late 19th century, specifically through ghosts, doubles, alter egos, have aided in the destabilization of the boundaries between psyche and reality and opened up an indeterminate zone that blurred the differences between fantasy and actuality. Sigmund Freud writes here about the uncanny in 1922, noting that, quote, "In general, we are reminded that the word heimlich is not unambiguous, but belongs to 2 sets of ideas, which, without being contradictory, are yet very different," On the one hand, it means what is familiar and agreeable, and on the other, what is concealed and kept out of sight. Everything is uncanny that ought to have remained secret and hidden, but has come to light, end quote. This presents several challenges in categorizing Gothic utterances as they are represented sonically, as sound can add an additional interpretive layer that blurs the relations between visibility and presence and invisibility and absence. The spectral phenomenology itself partly contributes to Gothic's sonic uncanny, particularly in the later 19th century tradition when writers were participating and shaping a tradition that explored terrors and horrors closer to home. The visible and disembodied terms which have often been used to conceive of spectrality characterize Sanchez's rendering of Cowain's Gothic text. Spectrality interrupts chronology and has several disruptive effects on the perceptions of linear time. Jacques Derrida describes the spectre with a reference to Shakespeare. The time is out of joint, time is articulated, dislocated, dislodged. Time is run down, on the run and run down, deranged, both out of order and mad. Time is off its hinges. Time is off its course, besides itself, disadjusted, end quote. Cowain's ghosts remind us that Gothic time is always out of joint, using each present to house spectras of various pasts, and the various phenomenological experiences of musical time add additional layers to the interpretations of Gothic temporality. The focus on spectrality as a pervasive cultural condition has been thoroughly examined in Derrida's account of ontology, a term he characterized as a state of temporal, historical, and ontological disjunction in which presence is replaced by a non-deferred origin. Considering the phantomality of narration, the notion that the ghost story's medium of transmission, essentially language, is not a stable signifier, the Gothic as a mode of discourse can be seen as ontological in that putting Cowain's ghost into words creates the phantoms inhabiting the narrative and also evokes the specters of language. Sanchez's Gothic atonement imposed a narrative of disparate incidents told from a single protagonist, or a wanderer in this case, perhaps, beginning first with Cowain's poem Praeterita, which already contains imagery of the sonic Gothic embedded in the last line of text. The ghost, particularly with the ghost harpsichord. So on the handout there, I did put a list of the primary musical materials. So we're only going to take a look at maybe the first three today, and at least to underscore the points that I have laid out here. We can see that in the very first example, images of decay, putrefaction, and eternal stillness are heavily present in the opening stanza. Sounds that appear to emanate from nowhere to accompany the suffocating spaces for the first appearance of the cycle's ghost, the protagonist's beloved. The encounter with her has rendered the familiarity he once had with his home as eerie or uncanny in Freud's use of the term. The slow tempo, repeated rhythm in the left hand, slow harmonic rhythm, and continued return to the G pitch center throughout the harmonic spaces evoke a sense of the disturbingly familiar, the desolate habitat of a romantic wanderer who unknowingly encounters part of his past. Anxiety arises after the protagonist senses that silence talks, as we are now confronted with the possibility that this is now not his home as it once was. We immediately suspect a supernatural presence, one whose sounds of echo and wind are produced from an unknowable source, which leaves the reader to wonder as to whether the protagonist is himself insane or experiencing a hallucination. Upon entering the avoided room, as you can see, I have the text there for you, so I'm kind of narrating a little bit of the text itself while discussing some of the musical examples. So upon entering the voided room, near the end, he encounters his beloved with the ghostly golden hair, as you see at the end of the text there, sitting at their old harpsichord, which Sanchez depicts as being out of tune by using a light motive set in minor seconds. The motive's entrance generates several interpretations that could be seen as having a hauntological presence. One, it first functions as a kind of echo, one that encapsulates the horror experienced by the protagonist upon seeing his beloved as a corpse, while also anticipating the possibility of physical movement from her. Two, It arrives 2 measures before the speaker's final utterance in the piano, giving the impression of a disembodied voice that can only speak through an inanimate musical object. We know she is here, but we do not know how she got there, nor what she is specifically uttering through this antiquated instrument. How often do we see our spouse as a corpse about to play music in the forbidden room for us? And 3, we also may deduce from this echo a material contact with its sound generator, the harpsichord itself. Writing about the material quality of sounds as having a temporal dimension, Isabella van Elferen insightfully observed that, quote, echo suggests physical experience, but is disconnected from it like a doppelganger of its formal self, temporally removed from it, and therefore, to quote Shakespeare again, fundamentally out of joint. It is this ambiguity that allows perceivers to project onto them the haunting agency of their own repressed anxieties and thus to endow it with uncanniness, end quote. The music, in a way, has invited a ghost from the protagonist's past. So I'm going to play a little bit of the first example and then forward to the last example. Can I forward the clip inside? So the clip it's about 10 minutes in length, and I'm trying to just fast forward to about 8 minutes into the clip.
Well, normally the square shows up here.
Yeah, that's normally what I see as well.
But it doesn't, so I don't know.
Okay. Well,
Maybe if you exit out of the slideshow.
Okay.
And just try.
Oh, that's a good point.
Ah.
There you go.
If you play it, yeah, if you play it from there.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so here is example 3 in the text. Oh, that's not good. I have it on a jump drive. Maybe we can use another computer. Huh?
Let's. Did it just crash?
It says it's recovering and not responding.
Here's a jump drive.
But the music may not be embedded.
It's embedded in. It's
It
a
is
PowerPoint. It's a
embedded.
PowerPoint. Yeah. Always. Never
Yeah,
know.
you're better off with one of these than I am.
Do you know a password?
I think there should have been a password.
Well, I'll do a little bit of improvisation for a little bit, so while this is getting set up. I'll continue the paper, and then I'll go back and play some of the examples, and let's kind of see how we can go about it from that way, I suppose. Maybe we do this computer here, but we're going to go forward to the next work. It's Ghost, and I just have a couple of points on there, and then I'll finish with Vampire, which is the most thorough work. And the narrator appears to succumb in Ghost to the blurring of the temporal scheme. The image of the text immediately signifies a writing of excess. On the one hand, we are not sure if the protagonist is clearly insane, induces a feeling of terror from the reader. Yet on the other, it seems nearly laughable that he appears to be waltzing with a corpse. The pitches are muted by pressing a squeegee over the strings. I believe that should be example 4 in your handout. The pitches sound like an old music box and are played with a sparse waltz texture in the left hand. Curiosity, terror, and the uncanny in the passage freezes the faculties of reason. Let's do... Curiosity, terror in this passage freezes the faculties of reason, pacifying his mind and immobilizing the body. The sparse texture, slow tempo, and clear phrase terminations in the piano add to this weight of horror being expressed, encouraging a revulsive and contracted response to the text. So let's see.
You can do it in the
I can do it in the slide in that case. Okay, way to go. Okay, can you? I don't use Mac. I'm sorry. And.
Yeah.
Oops.
Slideshow.
And then just give us a slide to do it.
Oh, great.
So you want it to be...
Yeah, about 8 minutes in.
Yep.
Perfect.
Oh, maybe not.
Or maybe not.
This was happening in my lab as well.
Okay. I'm sorry, I don't use Mac.
Sometimes you have to like press it a couple times to get it to play.
Okay. So in Vampire, a good thing I have examples for you. So in Vampire, the protagonist has now sold his soul to the devil for a moment of pleasure. He has descended into madness and seems started way too late. It's a little... In Vampire, the protagonist has now sold his soul to the devil. It needs to play about 8 minutes. Okay. The protagonist has now sold his soul to the devil for a moment of pleasure. There we go. So this is example 3. Thank you so much. In Vampire, which is the third setting, the protagonist has now sold his soul to the devil for a moment of pleasure. He has descended into madness and seems all too willing to betray the memory of his beloved, only to later realize the fault of his transgression that causes him to seek atonement. The slow, repeated four-note ascending figuration from the outset signifies that our wanderer has been induced into a trance-like state. The text suggests that he retains a minimal amount of agency. He seems to be horrified by what he sees, yet does nothing to stop it. As uttered in the fourth stanza in the text you have, not even God can take him away from can even take him away from this hour. It is perhaps the most uncanny moment in the cycle. A perceived arrival of the off-screen spectral presence occurs in measure 18, with the arrival of the beloved's theme placed in octaves in the low register of the piano. The dynamic contrast from the song's beginning texture aids in the blurring of the spatio-temporal dimensions that so characterize the Gothic as a narrative mode of discourse. The theme's entrance encourages us to imagine a doubling, as the vampiress is assigned the theme of the beloved, encouraging the perspective of an ontological presence in an unclearly defined past which has now been transformed into the present. The uncanny of the beloved, now possibly existing in the protagonist's insane mind in the form of a vampiress who is about to devour him, reveals a common example of the Gothic as a language of opposite extremes. The beautiful can be horrific. The temporal scheme is further blurred by the large rhythmic augmentation of the theme, which has become nearly unrecognizable due to the degree of durational increase and its proportional irregularity. The supernatural has given way to the psychological, leaving our protagonist unsure of himself and his own environment. That's going to spoil the whole thing. You don't have to move it anywhere. So you hear this, the entrance of this low B in a little bit, and it's supposed to sound as if this vampire is coming, but we're not sure if it's the vampire or the beloved herself. Gothic Atonement is currently one of the most important examples to rejuvenate, reanimate, and revitalize the curious reception of Madison Cowain's poetry in modern song. Furthermore, it may possibly prove to reevaluate and re-intensify the debates surrounding Cowain's poetry in American literati circles. Cowain never prophesied that his words would be remembered through musical settings with new imagined and imposed narratives, nor would he have considered his foray into the Gothic as an interest to later readers, or more of an interest to later readers, than his poems about nature and romance. However, he did wish that his poetry would live, And Sanchez's setting not only demonstrates that Cowain's wish was worth fulfilling, but also that Cowain's Gothic ghost, as presented through more conservative approaches to verse, can allow for new opportunities for the modern song composer to contribute to Gothic musical discourse. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the improvisation through the technical difficulties. So
No
I
problem.
need to update my computer.
This was wonderful. Questions, please.
Yes, ma'am.
It seems like this is part of a larger group or subset of new song cycles that approach these topics. Could you just tell us a tiny bit about what else is out there that is part of this group?
Well,
Like this?
you mean song cycles by this particular composers, or song cycles engaging in this kind of discourse?
Is there a community of this, or is this a standalone piece?
I heard this work in this composer's house, and I immediately jumped out of my seat whenever that low B came. Now, I listened to it from beginning to end. Now, the whole cycle is about 35, 40 minutes long. So the narrative really is what makes the mode of Gothic discourse effective in this example. So if you localize everything, as I had to do for the purpose of the presentation, of course it should, I think, get some of the effects to be present, but if you're listening to it from beginning to end and you really invested in the protagonist and what awaits his fate, then it becomes really exciting. As far as other song cycles, I'm not really sure. I just heard this live in this composer's house, and I thought this would be a really interesting engagement. Yeah.
So if you have some sort of connection with this composer, then he's like lives in the area, or is he recognized? What
he's actually well, he's a composer and performer, so okay. He's a well-established performer. I'd say in the piano community. Okay. And his compositions now are starting to gain a lot of credence in the song world, because he's written 6, 7 very large-scale song cycles and received multiple performances by several different well-known performers. So, yeah, I guess you could say that I have a personal connection with it.
Well,
Absolutely.
the reason I ask is, do you know how he came upon this poet that is a little lesser recognized, though?
Oh, that's a good question. So Madison Cowain's poetry, well, thanks to Google Books and many of all these works kind of existing in public domain, he was kind of looking for the challenge of trying to set something that's a little more conservative in versification. So Madison
he was looking for that.
Yeah, yeah. He thought it would be an exciting challenge, and he really enjoyed the imagery that a lot of those Gothic texts present. But I remember one specific conversation when she said, "I really am enjoying this challenge of trying to set verse that's a little more strict, and at least through my own musical vocabulary." So I thought that was really quite interesting. So yeah. Yes, sir.
Do you know if he likes metal?
If he likes metal? I don't think so.
That seems like metal to me.
I guess so. Who knows? He actually specializes as a performer in Spanish piano music, and he's the last established performer to have studied with Alicia de la Rocha. So he has a degree under her from the Marshall Academy in Spain before she passed away. So he was first as a well-known performer, and then as time passed, he said that I wanted to really enjoy composing a little bit more. So he started kind of doing that. Now I think he composes almost as much as he plays.
So somewhere between Albanese and Iron Man.
So somewhere between Iron Man by Ozzy Osbourne and the low B there. Well, there's a connection, I suppose.
Are there any other settings of K1's poetry as song from the?
That's a really good question. So I found, at least searching as much as I possibly could, there are 3 recent settings that have been done in the last 2 years. Nothing in terms of scope as compared to this. When he was living, there actually were a few settings that were presented, but they were mostly in fun gatherings. None of them were published. There are 3 or 4 or 5 settings that were published after he died, probably in the 1920s or so. And his wife actually did set about 6 or 7 of his poems. And those were never published. So in terms of scope, this is the largest. This is the largest work. So kind of curious what brought him to it.
Yes, please.
Yes, sir.
So I'm not quite familiar with the work, but just looking at the example that you provided, it seems like the sort of you have this sort of a minimalist approach that's very prominent throughout the work.
The most interesting comparison that I've heard in the last week, as I did present this presentation to a friend of mine, not in any conference, but just had, hey, listen to this, what do you think? And he's also a musicologist, and he said Arvo Pärt, at least in certain places, and I kind of thought, I didn't expect that, but if you listen to the entire thing, of course I've isolated some moments for you. The entire thing has a lot of different kinds of musical languages going on and a lot of different kinds of musical movements. Yeah, but it's a really interesting connection.
Any other questions? I see none online, so let us thank our I hope you will not run away. We will have our business meeting. I will switch off the live stream for 10 seconds, and then we'll come back on. And I think there's a reason for it. And we will set up, and it will take 1 minute. I need to.
Of course, we are not running out, but if you have to run out, the security told me they do close several of the doors here, so he asked the 3 doors that you should leave by when you leave. There's the crash bar right here. That one's good. And if you go down to where the entrance was, the one that goes out from the main entrance, and the one that we actually came in from the restaurant, those 3 doors, he asked that we just use those ones when we're leaving. If you have any questions, I can walk you through that.
Yes, because the front doors are locked.
But it should be okay to go out now.
Oh, is it? Okay,
Yeah.
It took me like 15 minutes walking.
Yeah, I
trying
think
to
what they've
find
done
a
is
door to get in.
they've kind of locked things down, but you should be able to get out. But if you have to, this one right here with a crash bar.
Yes. So I wonder, can you hear me? I can hear you. I just have to figure out
Yeah, that should be picked up by then.
how to get this. Aha. Maybe now? Yes.
Oh, there I am.
Okay, very good.
I also have a microphone if I need to be louder.
No, this is fine.
Okay.
So now the audio that you are getting through Skype is from my internal mic on my computer, which may not be very good. So you may get a better audio from the live stream.
Okay.
But you can see how it works.
Okay.
And so we can leave you on here, but we have a few other items first.
Of course.
Great. And how do I make this large? Okay. Okay. Anyway, so Dr. Wheelton will present the report by the committee in just a few minutes. Are we ready to go? Great. So let me open the business meeting. I would like to thank the University of Texas, San Antonio, the Department of Music, and Drew just ran out, right? I will thank him again when he comes, but the chair of the music department, who we saw earlier today, and of course Drew, who organized everything and coordinated everything with the Music Biz Day. So I will say that again briefly when Drew comes back, so he can get a little applause. I would also like to thank the program committee, Dr. Kendra Leonard, Dr. Drew Stephen, and Dr. Kevin Sullivan, who reviewed proposals and basically selected the program. Thanks to our editors of our AMS Southwest chapter proceedings, Dr. Melissa Cummins and Dr. Kevin Mooney. Thank you. So let's give them all an applause. Thank you. And Drew's back, so you missed the thank you, but we want to thank you for organizing everything, Drew. Thank you so much, this was wonderful. And of course, I would like to thank our Secretary-Treasurer. It's the most diligent kind of work. I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into it, a lot of communication with proposers, putting the program together, taking care of minutes from last year, preparing agenda.
It's a lot of fun. My term is up next year, so
it's a lot of fun. It's very little work. No, thank you, Kevin. Thank you. Future meetings. So we will meet at TCU on October 5th. That's usually the first Saturday, is usually the day AMS Southwest meets, and Dr. Tim Watkins has confirmed that day. So it is now confirmed, so you can mark your calendars. Also confirmed is the Spring 2020 meeting. It will be at the University of Houston, and it will be a joint meeting with the Beethoven Conference that the University of Houston, actually a Beethoven festival, a 2-week festival that the University of Houston is hosting. And one weekend or 3 days, the February 27th through 29th, will be the conference, which will be a joint meeting between AMS Southwest and TSMT, Texas Society for Music Theory. And I believe this will be the first time ever we will have a joint meeting with the Texas Society for Music Theory. Dr. Virginia Wielton is in fact interested in hosting the fall 2020 meeting at Texas Tech University, potentially with TMLA, so the Texas chapter of the Music Library Association. And finally, we have interest, and that emerged a week ago at the SEMSP meeting, which stands for Society for Ethnomusicology Southern Plains chapter. So it's the regional chapter which overlaps exactly like our chapter. It's Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Texas of SEM. They are interested in having a meeting jointly with AMS Southwest in spring 2021, and that will be hosted by Dr. Stephen Friedson at the University of North Texas. Any comments, feedback, suggestions? Very good. So as we have talked before about the possibility of creating a scholarship in the name of Cheryl Murphy Manley, who was our immediate past president. She was a president, in fact, this today would have been the end of her second term if she would have gone on for 2 terms, but she only was able to be president for 1 year, and then we had a special election, and that was my first term was her second year of her first term as president. And so as most of you know, she passed away, and we want to honor her with a scholarship. She was always very interested in helping others and helping students. In fact, when I was secretary-treasurer, she always came up and said, gave me like a $50 bill and said, here are my dues, and the rest is for students who cannot afford it. And I think it would be a very nice gesture to continue that tradition, but even more, also providing some kind of a travel stipend to a student, maybe a first-time attendee of AMS Southwest, and a student with maybe financial need who would otherwise not be able to afford. and I wanted to discuss this here also in our membership meeting. Any thoughts, suggestions? So the question is where the money would come from. Of course, we do have, the chapter has money, but if we give out $100 or $200 more every time, eventually we will run out of money. But we can raise the money. I personally would be willing to pitch in some money every year. And I think there are others of us who would be willing to do that. And so I think, so this is not an endowment, at least at this point, but we could do some kind of annual fundraiser for it and then give out those scholarships, and we would announce it so people could apply for it. Any thoughts?
Seems like a great idea. I think anything that can encourage students in particular to come to chapter meetings.
Right.
Introduce them to the work of the chapter, to other music colleges is a great idea.
Yes.
I particularly like the notion of a first-time attendee. I think that would be something that Cheryl would feel really good about.
Yes.
It's great.
Great. Good. So this actually ties into the next point. And because if we actually move our finances to the national office, fundraising will also be easier. Easier in the sense that our chapter right now is not tax exempt. It's not a non-profit organization. That status was revoked a few years ago and was revoked from all of the chapters of AMS for partially unknown reasons. And it is very difficult for AMS to get that status back on behalf of the chapters. And the easiest solution, according to Bob Judd, is to move the finances to the national office, because the national organization has the non-profit status. So if we move our account there and all the money flows through the national office, it would fall automatically under it. So if we were to fundraise for the scholarship in honor of Cheryl, then anybody who donates to it can also tax deduct or use it as a tax deduction, although that's probably not a whole lot and probably not so relevant. But there are other reasons for it also. We have been in the committee that Virginia is chairing, and she will report on this in a bit. We also have been discussing accessibility, and one issue, for example, is voting. Voting for those members who cannot come to the meeting. It is, in fact, right now it's written in our bylaws that you can vote either by mail or by email ahead of the meeting, and we have done this. We have distributed it, and 3 members took advantage of it. But it is not totally anonymous, because at least the chair of the nominations committee who gets the vote will see who voted. But then from then on, of course, they only tally anonymously, but it's not totally anonymous. Another issue is really only those are qualified to vote who are members of our chapter. We always vote in spring semesters. Elections are always in spring semesters. How our bookkeeping works or our membership works is most people pay when they arrive at the spring conference. That means actually 2 weeks ago we had 0 members. Our chapter had technically zero members. We had members last year, but we didn't yet have members. So another advantage of moving the finances to the national office is the dues could be collected as part of the national dues, and we would, at all times, our chapter would have members. And that means that if we wanted to organize online elections to through some election software, we could pull the database of current members set up the online voting and vote online. In fact, we could move to purely online voting that way. Any thoughts, feedback on those issues? Specifically, moving the chapter finances to the national office. It would not get rid of the treasurer portion of the secretary-treasurer, because we still need our that person to oversee the finances, to request the checks from the national office. That secretary-treasurer would not write the checks him or herself anymore, but it would go through the national office. I have experienced this with CMS, the chapter, the South Central chapter in CMS, and it works quite well. Yes?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, actually, based on your experience, or Kevin, or Greg, weren't you secretary-treasurer at one point? Do you think that any of these, do you think that move would be good from your standpoint as having been secretary-treasurer?
Well, yeah, I like, for all those reasons that Nico pointed out, I thought we're on target.
So the only question that I have is, does the national office expect anything to manage those funds?
Not as far as I know. Yes.
No, I mean, two chapters already do this. I think Capitol and Allegheny, and it's simply a pass-through operation about judge's office. And at chapter officers' meetings, when this question has come up, the officers from those chapters have always spoken favorably of how it simplified their lives, whereas other chapters have been struggling with the tax gift, mainly in dealing with banks, because as the treasurers have changed, bank accounts have changed, and you end up having to pay on bank
redo everything.
Right.
Yeah, and I can just speak to the fact that it does make things more efficient, and that's how we do it for our chapters. It go through, and then you pay your chapter due while you're paying your national, and it works really well, especially when you're doing your own taxes, because it all comes out in one swoop instead of individuals.
Right. Now, it does have one disadvantage, and that is, in the past years, we have had some members, or at least we may have had some members, who were chapter members because they paid their chapter dues, but they were not national AMS members. From the perspective of national AMS, that was not supposed to be like that. From the perspective of our chapter, we welcomed anybody who wanted to come to our chapter meetings. So, but if we were to do that, that would, at least in that way, not be possible anymore. We can still welcome them, I guess, without being member, but then we would surely not get their $5 or $10. Yeah. On the other hand, we would probably take in more money, because more national AMS members would actually pay chapter dues, because not all 181 members that we had as of a month ago attend these conferences, as you can see around this room, right? We do have 181 national AMS members who live in our region, so who technically would be part of our chapter if they chose to pay our chapter dues. And so more of those may decide to pay those $10 or $5 for students. It sounds good?
You need a motion to approve the moving of chapter finance?
I take that as a motion. Any second? Second. Anybody? Any more discussion? Anybody in favor? Say aye. Aye. Anybody opposed? Say nay. It passed unanimously. So we will. Kevin will have to figure out. He will, of course, have to close the account, and we'll have to figure this out. But there's no rush. But within the next few months, I'm sure we can figure this out nicely. Perhaps with the overlap of the end of our fiscal year, which is at the end of May or June? No, April or May? End of April, right. Okay, very good. Are there any other announcements? Okay, I will hand this over to Kevin briefly for...
This will be quick. The very last page of your agenda is the treasurer's report. The minutes are also on there, just before on the second to last page. But in the treasurer's report, nothing really unusual here. Notice the dues are for total of 2018 in that section. And the numbers don't actually quite work out in that point when we do that, because this financial report is actually from May through April. So there's a little bit of an overlap there. But nothing really unusual. $3 for a way I had to buy some extra checks. Hubert Oberdorfer expenses, student travel. The domain registration is not in there. We just got that in yesterday, about $281 and some cents. Is that about right?
Yes, that's web hosting for the next 3 years.
For the next 3 years. So
and it includes, it's $15 a year for the domain registration.
Okay.
So that was for 1 year for web hosting.
Okay, okay. So yeah, 15 for the domain registration year. Okay.
So really, this is not as of April 30th. So this will slightly change for the final
Right.
report,
Right.
especially with the income of the
Right,
of
we made
what we.
150 today.
Very good. Any
That's it.
other any discussions on the minutes from our last meeting?
Which relate to our probably main topic today.
Right, on the back side of that page, there was already a discussion on accessibility. So I've seen them before, and I didn't tell you about it because I thought it was cute, but Skype is spelled with a Y.
Oh, okay.
But
You can tell I don't Skype. Okay.
I could tell, but I thought it was so nice that I didn't want it.
Moving on.
Okay, any other comments on the minutes? Very good. We will move on to Virginia. Can you say something to check the sound?
Hello.
Okay.
Hi again.
Good. We hear you well. Do you?
Okay, that's great. So, we'll see if my cat crashes again. So, she crashed. So, it's great to actually see you all. That it's great to talk to you. And thank you to the 49 people who have filled out the survey for me.
Hold on 1 second. 1 second. It will come back here. Okay. I'm sorry. It was gone for a second. Can you start your sentence over?
Oh, sure. So thank you to the 49 people who have filled out this survey. This was created jointly by members of the committee established after the Canyon meeting on accessibility, diversity, and sustainability. We have a good number of results now. I wanted to talk through some of them with you. There were one or two surprises, but there are a couple things that were, and also I wanted to put some of the information in further context. So I want to show you some of the Google results and then switch over to the PowerPoint and sharing the screen. That sounds like it works?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to share the screen now. And is it us?
No.
Not yet? Okay, start sharing. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Is it up?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So, thank you to everyone who shared this. I personally emailed many people at different institutions in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas because we want this just to be a sort of system. As you can see from the results here, 90% basically of our responses were from Texas. We did have some responses from Arkansas and then a few from out of state. So that's the background who responded. We had almost 75% of people respond saying that music helped with their primary field. There were some other disciplines related to music, and even some that not specifically music, like humanities and English. And in terms of occupations, I was really glad to see that we had a mix. We had the largest group of tenure track or tenure faculty members, then followed by students, 8 faculty members, archive librarians, and then there were a variety of other occupations presented as well. For example, the music teacher. If you have any questions from going along, let me know. It's a little weird, the feedback from hearing the sound of me there and the sound of me here. I'm just working with it, but if you have questions, let me know. In terms of who responded as well, our demographics were that almost 75% of people were national members, and that only 10% never had been a member of AMS or were not a member of a closely related society. Only 47% basically were current members of the chapter, but only 18.5% never had been. And we had a really good mix as well of people. This is how long we've been a member of AMS-SW. So the largest group that had been members for 5 years, but you can see here in the 15-year term we have that as well. I'm happy to say that the cost of the chapter membership is not preventing people or the people that responded from being members of the chapter. The greatest factor keeping people from becoming members is the difficulty of travel to meetings and the cost of travel to meetings. And this is not anything that was a surprise to us as a preliminary discussion. There were some other reasons, but those two were the large ones and that we'll be coming back to. In terms of responses, just going through this quickly, just over 70% of people had attended a Southwest chapter meeting in the last 3 years, responded, and then just half had presented. And this is this was interesting to me. I was expecting the Facebook page to be the largest medium for people to find out about our chapter meeting. It is actually the AMS Southwest email list. So yay for listeners and for that technology. I was sad that people weren't hearing so much from place or campus colleagues about the meetings, and that again something to come back to. One of the things we wanted to establish was how much is AMS Southwest serving a unique function for members of the chapter, and the answer is it's serving a pretty unique function. So, as you can see from this, most people in the chapter attend some other academic conference during the year other than AMS Southwest. You can see that here a really small 0.1%. However, when we move to looking at what the people would have for in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, what the reports that regularly where they can share their research, the largest group here is very unlikely. So it's very unlikely that more than 30 people who responded to this are going to have some other form they can share their research on a regular basis in Texas, Oklahoma, or Arkansas. Just over half pick somewhat likely, or very likely. And then in terms of the other psychologists, this has been a more issue, I think, because here the largest thing was somewhat unlikely, but more than half of respondents thought it was going to be somewhat unlikely or very unlikely they would have a chance to meet a musicologist from Texas, Oklahoma, or Arkansas, apart from the Southwest meeting. Any questions or comments?
Not so far.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to go just pass over these questions about voluntary and mandatory training. I think we need some more information to contextualize those. The responses were pretty mixed on that. In terms of the AMS experience, we have people to describe in their own words what they believe to be the purpose of AMS chapter. And I went through this and I found that the few things people most often mention are something about having something that is local, having something that is a place to network, something that is a community, and actually 4 things, and then sharing research. So of those things that were mentioned most often, one of them is directly research, and 2 of them are more about community or familiarity. So that was that was matched by the next question is, why do people attend AMS Southwest meetings? Largest results there were present papers, but actually even more than that, the network of other scholars. So those are equally important concerns for us to be thinking about, and this is a question that came up with me in terms of thinking about what are we trying to make it point. Because the live stream is making presenting accessible and view presentations accessible, and a certain sort of networking accessible, but there are also other forms of networking that we can't get just for a live stream. So that could be a question going along. And then people not attended AMS Southwest meeting, it wasn't not having an expertise on a paper. I thought that would be much higher than it was. I guess goes back to issues of travel, distance, and cost of travel. And then conflict was up to professional activity. So we're all busy, and quite a bit. Not feeling connected to the AMS Southwest community was a 4th factor there. So something else we need to discuss further. And similarly, in terms of why people might attend in the future, it comes back to distance and cost of travel. Fortunately, almost 60% of respondents said that AMS had come within an hour of where they live. And then conversely, we only had about 12% of people who said it was 5 hours or more was the closest they had to meet. Is this good? Any questions at this point?
No, everything is good, but there's some audio. The audio quality is not very good. Are you using your microphone, or do you have a microphone that has a earbud?
Yeah, I have those now. So
let's try if that works a little bit better.
Okay.
And any other questions so far? Everything is good so far.
Okay. In terms of looking at travel, because we knew this would be an issue, we were looking at how far people would travel to connect and how far people would travel to attend. And I think the numbers here are something we want to keep in mind as we think about the locations and frequencies. So in terms of the furthest people have traveled by car or by bus. We were looking at this because we didn't want to count airplane travel, which is expensive most of the time. So, as people have traveled, we have a quarter of respondents saying that they have traveled 7 hours to present at a AMS-SW meeting. A quarter that traveled is 5 to 6 hours, and then you can see that a quarter was uncomfortable, and then a quarter was less than 6 hours. I was really impressed that we had a quarter of people saying they traveled 7 to 10 hours. In terms of not attending, as we would say here, the numbers would be a bit lower in terms of fewer people willing to travel the long distances, or people willing to travel a shorter distance. So, for 4 respondents, they would only come to attend an AMS-SW meeting if they were presenting, if it were within an hour of them. In terms of future planning, this was asking how far they'd be willing to travel, so not what had happened in the past. You can see that we had most people say that they would be willing to travel somewhere between 3 hours and 6 hours. So that was our largest group. There was a quarter with willing to travel 7 to 10 hours, and then much smaller contingent that was going to be traveling less than 3 hours to the conference to present. In terms of not presenting conference, again, the numbers there, they're all shifted a little bit lower. So, whereas we had 30% of people say they travel for 4 hours to present a conference, we had, let me put this way. If they're not presenting, then the first did lower, so this moved around. Does that make sense? Was the statistic? It's okay, end of the day, I'm tired. So basically, the 1 to 2 hour that got longer, and this group also accepting larger points would travel further to larger, or to the presenting conference. So that that's a little weird right now, but I'm persevering. So it would help us attend a conference in the future more. It takes address that cost of travel or difficulty of travel. So having a carpool ride board, 18 people, said that would help. And I've been in contact with Christine about having a platform for that. Also being able to have reduced cost of overnight accommodation, whether by staying with friends or some other lower cost option, the roommate would help. And then the 4th factor most commonly picked is having for children who could sit by themselves, not adult supervision. This question I'm going to skip over for right now because, as someone greatly pointed out, the original thing was a little bit confusing. That being said, there's been a lot of support for the public musicology lecture idea. And in terms of AMS members presenting at other chapters, there have been a group that's done that, 8 of the respondents. And the reasons were that travel is less expensive. That was the top reason picked. Also that they can be closer. And then an opportunity to visit another part of the country, which is no reflection of the infrastructure for our chapter, just on the benefits of the country. And then people who haven't presented in another chapter in the past but would consider doing so in the future, the reasons related to that are pretty similar, that they're closer where the travel is less expensive, or being in another part of the country. The live stream, I was somewhat surprised by the results for this. almost a third of people said that they would be very unlikely to want to present remotely. So this is no poor reflection on Skype or our live streaming initiative, but it is interesting that a third of people do not want to be presenting remotely, and in fact, only just under 20% of the respondents said they'd be very likely to want to present remotely. Awareness about our live stream, it was almost 50-50, but more people didn't know about it than did, so please spread the word in the future. Help us get the word out there with that. And in terms of tuning into the live stream, would people tune into it again? Half of it was maybe, just over a third was yes, and then there was a decided group saying no as well. And then the reasons for wanting to tune into the AMS Southwest live stream, if it were to happen again, were close to the same sort of things that we had for attending meets in person. But there are some telling differences. The top reason was to watch specific papers, which is not something that people had mentioned earlier on, wanting to go to a meeting to hear about specific papers. Also, supporting colleagues was important, and that had been important earlier. Maintaining a connection to the chapter, but it seems that the motivations for tuning into the live stream are not quite the same motivations that people have for attending the meetings in general. And only 20% of people said that they would be likely to tune in to watch at least papers. So getting a substantial chunk of the conference. In terms of general perceptions concerning accessibility, diversity, and sustainability, a lot of the responses were, I don't know, or I don't think there's very much of this going on. And that, I think, speaks to the fact that we should have a larger discussion as a chapter, because the first thing I asked the committee members to do was to talk about what they thought we were all going to do towards accessibility, diversity, and sustainability, what was going well for us. But I would say about half the responses were, I don't know, or I don't think there is anything, any sort of initiative in this way. So I think one of the things we could do is establish a mutual understanding of what we're trying to do towards these, already trying to do towards these concerns, and then what we're planning to do in the future. And one final note for our survey, I know that it is late in the day, and you all have had a very long day, that about a third of people said they would be willing to host if AMS-Southwest becomes their city. And then more than a third said that they might be able to host, and then just about a quarter said no. So this is one of the key things for trying to think about both reducing the cost of conference attendance and then also environmental sustainability issues. Now switch over to the PowerPoint because I wanted to put a couple of things into context. So the primary reasons that we said that we think AMS chapters are out there are that they're supposed to be providing some sort of local opportunities for networking, for solidarity or engagement with other scholars, and sharing research. This is what the AMS says about chapters. It's defined as a group of at least 10 members of the society in one locality, that's a direct quote, who may seek recognition as a chapter of the society, etc. So one of the things that we're going to have to think about is what we think of as a locality and how we can foster a sense of being in a locality. There's a very fun website. This one was Map4. So just so you can see, this is New England, and this is Texas here. We're quite a bit bigger than New England. We're quite a bit bigger than France, bigger than the UK, and bigger than Germany. So when we're thinking about those nations, the ones that are nations, not New England, we probably don't tend to think about those as localities. Arkansas, just for fun, I made Arkansas and Oklahoma blue. Nothing political, just trying to change up color here. And Oklahoma is bigger than Chicago. Arkansas is bigger than Greece. In terms of driving distance, I'll try and get to the next slide. Looking at the Arkansas axis that we have going on here, for someone to come from Jonesboro, which is in the extreme northeast corner of our chapter, to get down to Brownsville, that would take 14.5 hours of driving. For someone in Jonesboro to get over to Amarillo, that's nearly 12 hours. And again, trying to get to the next slide. In terms of looking at West Texas, from Amarillo to Brownsville, nearly 12 hours, and Amarillo to Houston is 9 hours. One of the questions that came up from many respondents was about including states other than Texas, and the sense that going along with that, states other than Texas were having meetings that were further away from them. One of the things that I went through is I went through and I mapped out the last 3 years of meetings, and I found that that does not actually bear out. Oftentimes meetings have been closer to cities in Oklahoma than they have been to other cities in Texas, even when the meetings are in Texas. So San Antonio, you can see here, this was the meeting, different places people came from are in red, and then drive distance is there from that city to the conference. I'm going to go through this just to show you. I'm not going to talk through each one. In terms of Dallas, there were people who came from places that were more than a 4-hour drive away in Texas, but Oklahoma cities were actually closer, and Fayetteville was about equivalent to West Texas in terms of distance. In terms of the Huntsville meeting, you can see same sort of information going on here. Again, comparable for Western Arkansas and for Western and West Texas, and then Oklahoma actually closer than some other cities from some cities in Texas. This was Lubbock. This was Canyon, where we had a lot of people who were coming, this was McKinney, and this one was Canyon, where we had a lot of people who were driving more than 5 hours to come. In terms of institutional affiliations of who has been presenting at AMS Southwest, most represented institutions in the last 2 years or 3 years have been Texas State and Texas Tech, followed by University of North Texas and UT Austin and Trinity, and then you can see we have others there. So you can see that despite the fact that Texas Tech is quite far in West Texas, there have actually been a number of presenters from there who have made some substantial drives. Same thing with Texas State, seeing a lot of substantial drives from there as well. So bringing this up is not to try to make one institution look better or one institution look worse, but to note that distance of driving does not seem to be corresponding with actual level of involvement from members of the institution. One concern that also came up was that there were a number of people who thought that the chapter should be primarily trying to serve graduate students. That was something I saw maybe 15 to 20% of the respondents mention. And within those responses, there were also concerns that graduate students were not well represented enough in the chapter. Emily and Hank did some wonderful work looking at what was going on with other AMS chapters and in terms of graduate student and percentage of involvement and professional activities. for graduate students. So as it turns out, in the last 3 years, we're the leading chapter with professional development activities that we either aimed at graduate students or especially appropriate to them and for the populations in the chapter. So that was great news. The not so great news was that we had the second lowest percentage of grad presenters at 31.03%. Only the Greater New York chapter had a lower percentage of grad presenters. And as you can see, a lot of chapters fall somewhere in this 40% range, somewhere between 40 and 50%. And just also in terms of chapter size, in terms of membership, not in terms of geographic space, we are the 5th largest chapter. So that is the information that we have right now. And we are working on creating a checklist of concerns that can be built into conference planning to try to make conferences more accessible, and then also touch on concerns of diversity and sustainability. But I'd love to hear from you all. Any reactions from you all, or questions?
Questions? Comments? Suggestions? I think there was a lot of information. Everybody looks tired.
Yeah.
And thinking.
Can we link the Google Doc that has the data? Would that be possible?
Can you make the data available, what you showed us, the document?
So, I think that I certainly can make some of it available. We didn't ask for permission for people to have their individual written responses shared, so I would have some concerns about, giving, what was actually put in prose as confidentiality, in terms of confidentiality, but we could have just the sort of one of the charts.
Yeah, you could also pick up the top maybe 2 or 3 themes of those free responses and just do a little bit of qualitative analysis on that. I think that would be... Yeah,
I've been already doing that with some of the questions.
Great. Other suggestions or questions? Well, thank you so much for all your work. That was wonderful, very detailed, and I think that will help guide us developing some things that can help our members and potential members. So, thank you.
Can I ask?
Yes.
Can I ask a question to you all then?
Yes.
I know it's a long day and probably would have dinner. But in terms of graduate students, because of that concern about having more graduate student involvement, I would be particularly interested in hearing more about what might aid that, apart from addressing issues of cost of travel, if they have any suggestions.
Something that I wonder about is the percentage of members who are graduate students. I think I remembered seeing that on the slide, relative to the number of institutions in the chapter that grant graduate degrees in musicology. Do you have any sense of correlation there?
That was something that I was looking into. Certainly we do have a lot of institutions that do grant graduate degrees in musicology, and there are other chapters that have fewer institutions, from what I can ascertain, but that still have a higher grad percentage of presenters. So.
Well, I think I can share from some of the meetings we had at the national conference with the other chapter presidents. There are some chapters who were the leaders of the chapter were actually unhappy about the low percentage of faculty participation.
Yeah, and there's that too.
So, and we surely don't have that, which is good. But maybe other comments from our students here or student representatives. Any thoughts?
could share one thought, I've just in the last year made the transition from graduate student member to now faculty member. And I'm noticing that my students are a little bit afraid. There's a lot of imposter syndrome in the graduate student community. I think they're a little bit intimidated, so I'm doing everything I can in my new role to encourage them to become active participants. I'm wondering if that's something others are noticing in their institutions. It's perhaps worth thinking about, that they may need a lot more encouragement in some cases from us to feel that they are ready to be members.
Did you hear that?
I did, and one of the comments that I thought was very valuable was suggesting that we have tenured, or I would suggest tenure track or tenured faculty members at institutions that have graduate students. We ask that there be one of those faculty members who's willing to serve as an AMS-SW ambassador. So trying to draw others into the chapter, and specifically I think focusing on grad students. Another thing that we could do is also establish something like they have at AMS National. So like if you're a first-time grad student attendee, having you paired with a mentor from another institution, so as a way to help you kind of learn how to network. That was something that had come up in at least one of the comments, and that I had thought of myself too.
Any other comments, suggestions?
I was fostered in the Midwest chapter as a grad student, and they're one of the higher ones for grad student participation. And as grad students, like we all talked to our friends and like looked at the programs together and got excited about papers, and like our professors were really like pushing us to go. So that might be something too. So like building on what you said.
Right. Did you hear that?
I did not hear that one.
So one of our attendees said she grew up in the Midwest chapter. Is it the Midwest chapter where graduate student percentage is higher, and they were also more pushed by the faculty, but they also got excited. They looked together at the programs and got excited about this. So, well, yes, go ahead.
Oh, well, I don't want to get into things too much, but I was a graduate student in the AMS Midwest chapter, and I found that one to be very, in my sense, non-accessible to graduate students, because it goes from all the way from like Ohio to Minnesota to Kansas. It itself accounts for about 20% of the U.S. members of AMS. It has nearly 600 people in its chapter. So I found that not to be very accessible as a grad student. That being said, I think there was a lot of excitement around it, but I think that it was very inaccessible. There was only one point during my time as a grad student in Indiana, which was about 10 years, when it was within 2 hours of me. Not trying to be mean to Midwest, but...
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because I was in Iowa, so most of the chapter meetings were in Chicago, so that's 4 hours, so it wasn't that far.
So yeah. She said she was closer probably to the meetings. Good. Any other comments? Great. Thank you again.
Thank you
for your wonderful work, and you will probably develop some specific suggestions.
Yes, definitely. And we already have something going for the conferences, sort of like a conference preparation checklist, but then also some longer term concerns. One of the issues which I think we'll need to also sort through as a chapter is that some people have suggested having essentially division meetings. So maybe like during the winter term, because some AMS chapters do have winter meetings, have sort of a meeting with more of the people in your division of AMS Southwest, rather than having a full meeting. But I can see how there could be concerns about that. I also see how that could be beneficial. But I know that it is not my job to figure that one out, just to report about it. So.
Great. Thank you. Let's give Regina an applause. So, thank you again. Are we?
She kept trying to crash the video.
Are we disconnecting now?
I think that'll be fine.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you, and see you later.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Okay, we do have still one more very important agenda item, and that is the elections. Now, as it turns out, a few who were here today have already left, and they left votes with Kevin. Chris Smith and Kimberly Montford, they jointly led the nominations committee. They were the nominations committee. And those who submitted votes electronically, this is in here, it's a tally. And I will give this to you. And so I guess I'm just leading I'm not supposed to lead this through, the nominations committee is, but none of them are here. And I don't think there's really anything that I can do wrong. But we do always ask, before we vote, if there are nominees from the floor. Any additional nominees? If there are none, let me just point out who among the nominees are here. Kevin Sullivan is here, and Greg Strawn is here, and they're both regular attendees. I don't think any of our student nominees is here today, right? I know Joanna, I think, presented at our last meeting. And I think they all presented at one point or another. They have attended conferences before. So any other comments, suggestions before we vote? Then mark your, do your voting.
Votes.
If anybody would like to help Kevin counting. So why is that?
It's the matrix.
Wow.
This is that mirrors showing us deeper truths that I was talking about.
Oh, it's because I'm still connected on this. All right. Okay, this is so cool. So the votes are being counted. If anybody would like to check that, that would be fine.
You can move on to my new business.
Yes, while the votes are being counted, Save the Trees, proposal to post minutes, meeting minutes and agenda on the website, discontinuing printing hard copies for attendees. Society of American Music does this. Any opposition?
As long as we have things available in alternative format, right? For ADA reasons.
But if it's posted as a PDF to the website, then anybody could, like, you can download it on a phone on a computer. What alternative formats should there be besides being PDF on the website?
We just should make sure that they're accessible to non-sighted people or those sorts of things.
Right, actually, that would be much more accessible than the piece of paper that we got today. Because the piece of paper would not be accessible, right? In fact, I've talked to Jamie. I'm so sorry if Jamie is online right now, from Nacogdoches. I forgot her last name right now, because I'm not good with names. I saw her again at the CMS meeting a couple of weeks ago, and she's blind, and we had been looking for a ride for her, and it's very difficult out of Nacogdoches because public transportation simply does not work, at least not to San Antonio. And to many other places, it's very, very difficult. So that's one thing, but if we develop some kind of transportation way, that would help as well. But she, in fact, at the CMS meeting raised the issue of handouts, right? If it would be electronically online, she could actually read it. Anything else?
I think it's a great idea. Let's get rid of the paper and put it all online, and then we can
yes.
feel good about not having.
So that agenda item came actually from Kevin, but you didn't actually mention the programs themselves, right? But that could be. That
no,
could.
No, I don't know. Don't you think we should? It's nice to have a program.
It's nice to have a program in my hand, right?
Yeah. Okay. All in favor? Do we have a motion? Do we need one?
We don't. We don't need one. We
okay,
just
we'll
do
move
it.
On. Let's vote. Okay, the voters are in. Are we ready?
Yes, we are ready for the announcement.
My parking is almost out.
Would you like to come here? Oh, all right. Would you like to come here? And
okay. For president, the vote was 12-7, and Kevin Selfin is the 12th.
Thank you both nominees.
And for student representative, the votes were 9, 8, and 3, and Brian Anderson got 9.
Congratulations to Brian. Is there any other new business? And I haven't checked the chat. I did now. There is nothing.
If I could have just 10
yes.
seconds.
Yes.
As outgoing representative, I'd like to thank all the members so much for 2 really great years and a wonderful experience, and also thank my counterpart, who will be a wonderful example for my successor. Thanks to all of you.
Yes, in fact, that should have been my task to also thank all of our board members, and I just realized that I did not do that. So Emily was our outgoing student representative, so let's thank her for all her service. Oh. Thank you. It was a lot of fun. And I want to close with one. I would like to urge any of you and viewers online, we have one more viewer online, to consider duties that are not really defined anywhere, such as live streaming, taking pictures, posting them on Facebook, on our Facebook group, things like that. So, or if there are new ideas, somebody will have to do it, and I can do it whenever I am here. As it happens, I will not be here October 5th, because I will be at the conference in Europe, which will be our next meeting. So for that meeting, for sure, we are looking for somebody who can take pictures, and we will have to see if the university can do the live streaming or if we have to do it ourselves, and then it's upon us. I mean, it's a great idea to do the live streaming, but somebody has to do it. And so I think if anybody wants to get more involved, I think there are many opportunities here. So anyway, so that concludes the live streaming. We will switch this off. If we could take a very brief group photo of those who are left here, just maybe on the nice, underneath the nice flowers there.